if you can imagine yourself on your deathbed bemoaning your life and saying, I really wish I had the energy, courage, or time to, the question is what comes after that?
Your hosts are here, Sammie and Michelle. By the end of this podcast, you'll know them well. Adulting, navigating the journey of life. Careers to relationships, pain and strife. Put down the rule book, rethink the status quo. If there's another direction you wanna go, find purpose, passion and mastery in all that you do with Status Post Adulting.
Hey, Status Post Adulting family. This is Sammie
and Michelle.
We are so excited to have Dr. Jordan Grumet, or Doc G, of the Earn and Invest podcast on Status Post Adulting. Doc G is a hospice doctor who has had a front row seat to the regrets of his dying patients. He wrote Taking Stock, a book that approaches financial independence from the perspective of someone who has seen many patients transition from life to death. Welcome to Status Post Adulting, Doc G.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you today. We are going to talk a little bit about your background, get a little bit familiar with some of the stories that you share in Taking Stock, which we really enjoyed, by the way. I did have a question for you first. You talk a little bit about this in your book, and so I thought it would be an interesting thing to get your perspective on. What is the difference between you only live once and you only die once?
Well, I think we make this mistake of thinking we only live once. This idea that once a moment is passed, it's gone forever and we can never get it back. And because of that, we make these spending decisions like, this moment could pass, I have to jump on it right away. There's this fear of missing out, so we spend lots of money immediately. The truth of the matter is, I think we live many lives. And because we live many lives, there are many new beginnings and new endings. And so, especially in the beginning of my career of thinking of finances, I often criticize people. I said, well, you don't want to bankrupt yourself now, and then when you start another one of those new lives, not have enough money. Maybe, right now you're single and you think, I got to live for today. But, in 5 years, you might be married and maybe you're going to have a baby and you want to take time off from work. And if you're frivolous with your money now, you're not going to have it then when you want to start a different chapter of your life. So I was very critical, actually, of YOLO. But then I also realized that from working with the dying, that they really regret things that they didn't have the courage or time or sometimes even the money to do. And so I realized that maybe I had to soften my stance a little bit. Like, there is a place for YOLO. I think we do have to live in the moment at times. And therefore, just this idea that you only die once it's over, it's gone. And if you have regrets when you're on your deathbed, you can't do anything about it. But we probably live several lives. And so we have to keep that in balance, this idea of spending money today versus saving for tomorrow. And I've softened my stance. I'm a little bit more likely to spend money in the moment than I used to be.
Yeah, I think we can both completely resonate with that too. Especially when we first got into financial independence, there's this whole idea of, oops, I was overly YOLO in some of those moments. And then I think you really frame it well, where we have multiple lives and, maybe some of those lives are more spendy, and then we're saving also for our future selves too, because we don't want to screw ourselves over either.
We tend to get very black and white about these things, and it's not at all. And I like the way you just said that is we have spendy times in our lives, and then we have times where we really knuckle down and save. And I think those can go well together. I don't think there's a problem with that. And maybe we have to give ourselves a little break sometimes.
Exactly. So we want to get our listeners kind of up to speed about your journey a little bit. What motivated you to become a doctor?
Well, when I was 7 years old, my father was a doctor. He was an oncologist or cancer doctor, and I completely idolized him. And he died suddenly. He had a brain aneurysm. He went to work one morning with a headache, collapsed while he was rounding at the hospital, and ended up on life support. And we removed life support a day or two later when the doctors told us that there was nothing that could be done. And I think he just died at that time when a little boy really looks up to his dad and wants to be just like him. So that kind of got stuck in my brain, this idea that my dad was a doctor, so I should be a doctor. And that really became the only thing I ever thought about doing. And it was a certainty. Like, actually, when I was younger, I had a learning disability and I had a lot of trouble learning how to read. In fact, it was questionable. For the first 3 or 4 years of schooling, I was way, way behind my classmates. I learned how to read late. So there's this question of either whether I'd have the intellectual capacity. But because my dad died when he did, it just became this kind of strange certainty in my life. And I never questioned it, which is something that, as I grew older and became a physician and started looking at my life, it really amazed me that I had never questioned this idea that being a doctor was just what I was going to do. It ended up becoming such an identity for me, which I think happens to anyone who goes into medicine, but certainly for me, because it was also part of that connection with my father. So it was the only thing I ever considered doing in life. And as I got older and found that I had other things I like to do, like write and podcast and interview people, all these things that now kind of light me up. In the beginning, when I recognized that these things were important to me, I often told myself, well, you can't do that. That's a hobby. But being a doctor, no, that's a job. So it's kind of always what I figured I would do.
It's so interesting on a few different levels. One, to have that certainty at such a young age and to have something like your father's death be part of or even your relationship with your father be part of the thing driving you. One, it's kind of wild that even at such a young age with a learning disability, you pushed on. It seems like was like a North Star for you, which in a lot of ways is a really good thing. At the same time, too, I can see how once you get to that stage in your life and you've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish, you might be hit with that moment of, oh, wait, I haven't thought about this since I was a kid. And now I've sort of built my life around that.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely this, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but it was never, this is actually what I want to do. Now, when I started out in medicine, I was very passionate about it. Like, this was very exciting to me. And even looking back as I've transitioned mostly outside of medicine, I do these other things that to me nowadays are more gratifying. I can't imagine living a life where I didn't go through those steps, right? Where I didn't become a physician, where I didn't get to help people and be involved in people's lives. So I don't look at it as a negative thing. I just think that it was kind of where my destiny took me. And as I got older, I learned how to start questioning these deeper assumptions I had. And even this idea that I could not be a doctor and yet still be close to the memory of my father. Those were things that I just had to be older to understand.
Yeah, and one thing I've always wondered about is it seems like you started blogging maybe before you even knew about financial independence. What kind of got you into that at first?
So I've always loved to write, and I think I've done it as a kid. I used to write poetry, and so the funny story is I started blogging specifically for a very odd reason. In the early 2000s, I was starting to get comfortable being a physician, and I've always had kind of an entrepreneurial or business mind, and I was living actually in St. Louis during my residency, and my wife and I had bought a condo, and we had all these walls to fill, and I had nothing to put on the walls, so we were at the local mall, and we stepped into an art gallery, and I found all these wonderful paintings of these figurative artists that did these beautiful paintings. I'm like, I'd love to have that on my wall. And then, of course, I looked to see how much it cost, and they were $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to buy this fine artwork. And right about then was when eBay was starting to really become popular. So I started looking up on eBay. I'm like, I wonder if I can find these same artists or the same original artwork, but for much less. And I started to find these people selling artwork for really cheap. The same stuff I saw in the gallery, but for $1,000 instead of $4,000. And so I literally got on the phone and started calling these dealers and started to learn some of the tricks about how you buy cheap artwork and sell it. There's a secondary art market. And so I started a business selling artwork. And I was starting this business and I made a website. And back in the 2000s, it was very basic, right? So I made a very basic website. And I was talking to my brother, who happened to be one of the very, very earliest bloggers. He was very interested in the concept. They used to call them weblogs then. They didn't call them blogs. And he said, well, here's the thing. There's this thing called SEO. And I'm like, what the heck's SEO? Search engine optimization. He's like, if you want people to get to your website to buy your artwork, you need to constantly update the content on that website. And he's like, the easiest way to do that is why don't you write a blog, connect it to the website, and update the blog from time to time. And that will get you better SEO and you'll sell more artwork. So this was in the early 2000s. I started a blog about artwork. I loved selling artwork, but I did not love writing about artwork. And so after doing this for about 6 months, I one day typed into Google or whatever was the search engine at that time. I think it was Google at that time. And I wrote in, doctor blogs. And I found a bunch of medical blogs, people talking about medicine, and I was enthralled. And from that day on, I changed my art website to one writing about medicine. It eventually became a blog called In My Humble Opinion. And for years and years and years, I wrote about what it felt like to be a doctor. Like, I feel like a lot of us as people in the medical community, we love to tell people what we know, but we're really bad at telling people who we are. And so I love to write these stories about medicine and who we are as healthcare givers. And, I was really passionate about it. And I knew that I loved to write. I knew I loved to express myself, to tell stories, and to try to divine some of the deeper meaning behind the day-to-day things we do. And it just became a passion of mine. And I had always liked to write before, but this was a much more organized way in which I could. And I did that for years and years and years before I eventually started writing about financial topics.
Wow. And then I'm guessing it was the writing about financial topics which ultimately led to the White Coat Investor or Jim Dolly reaching out to you. And in the book, you kind of talk about how that's a pivotal moment for you, kind of realizing what financial independence was, but then how that impacted you like emotionally too.
Oh, it was cataclysmic. I was still writing actually about medicine, and Jim wrote me because I had a fairly popular medical blog and he wanted people to know about his financial book, which was for doctors. So he sent it to me. And at that time in my life, I was questioning being a doctor. I was questioning financially how I could make my way through things so that I could leave medicine because it was causing me stress and burnout and anxiety, and yet have enough money to live. And no one could really give me those answers. Like, I talked to my financial advisor, I talked to my accountant. They gave me answers that didn't quite make sense, and they couldn't explain why behind what they wanted to do. And then Jim sends me this book out of the blue, a guy I didn't even know, and I read it. And within hours, I kind of said, wow, this is what I've been looking for this whole time. This is the financial information that'll help me decide how much I need to work and when I can stop. And I actually realized that I probably had enough money to stop right then and there, which was really exciting for a moment. And then I kind of fell into a pretty deep depression. I actually had a panic attack because for the first time in life, I could step away from the only way in which I had ever identified myself as a physician or someone who wanted to be a physician. And I was petrified because I didn't know who I was. And then I also knew that by doing this, in a sense, I was stepping away from the memory of my father and the little bit of connection I had with him. I mean, my dad died when I was 7. I don't have a huge number of memories of him. And this was something we shared. And, to think about sharing something with a father who died when I was a little boy, it was just a very difficult realization to come to. And yet it was what I deeply wanted. So that was hard. That was a very hard reckoning. I think it's hard anyway for physicians to leave their profession because it becomes part of identity. And then on top of that, I also had to leave the identity of a high income earner, which felt good to know I could support my family and make lots of money and save and invest and buy properties and all these wonderful things that being a doctor allowed me to do. And that was not something that was easy to get over. It took definitely months to get over kind of the shock and depression, but years to really work my way through this idea that it was okay and I could step away from that identity of being a physician because it wasn't serving me anymore, but that I could do that gracefully and transition to something else that would be just as special and powerful and good. It just took me a long time to realize that.
This idea of untying yourself from your identity, from your job title, from your high income earner status, I think that's something that's so interesting and something that so many people can relate to. Something you talk about in your book, which I think is related to this, is the art of subtraction. I'm wondering if, as you were going through this untangling of your identity and your work, is this when you started to think about the art of subtraction? Also, I guess, what is the art of subtraction? But how did that play a part in that untying?
It certainly did. And, so what I realized is that this identity that I had held on so tightly wasn't serving me anymore. And so I had to decide who I wanted to be, because I think a sense of identity is important, and there were things that were really important in my life. I just had never spent the time or energy pursuing them. So when I realized that maybe I wanted to step away from that identity of being a doctor, it was just too difficult to completely drop it and say, I'm done with this, and then discover a new identity. I just couldn't do that. It was too huge of a jump. So what I realized is that instead of jumping into a new thing immediately, one of the things I needed to do was look at the identity I'd built and see if there were parts of it that were worth keeping. And so I had this magical situation where all of a sudden I realized my finances weren't as important. I kind of had enough money to do what I wanted to do. So that gave me a clean lens to look at my job and say, well, is there something here that still fits me, that still feels aligned with my identity? So I started using the art of subtraction, this idea that why don't I remove all the things that I don't like about the workplace that cause friction in my life and then see what's left? And so at the time, I had a concierge medical practice. I was seeing patients in their home. I was also seeing patients in a nursing home. I was doing some side hustles like hospice work and directorship. And so I realized that the thing that was causing me the most stress was seeing patients in their homes and getting calls on Saturday night at midnight and having to run out and go see them. So the first thing I did was got rid of my concierge practice. I didn't need the money. This was causing me stress in my life. I got rid of it. And I did that for a good year or two. And then I realized that working in the nursing home was hard. You know, the patients were really sick. There was a lot of malpractice risk, things that kind of caused me to enjoy it less. So then I got rid of that. And I just did full-time hospice work, which really freed me to do something that I really did connect with. But then I looked at my hospice job and I said, you know what? I don't want to work nights. I don't want to work weekends. I don't want to be on call anymore. And so what I did is I kept on subtracting out or getting rid of those things that were giving me friction until I was left with what fit, that was comfortable, and that I identified with, which was doing part-time hospice work as a consultant where I was managing teams. I was supporting the nurses, the social workers, the chaplains, all the people who were doing the on-the-ground work, but I had a layer of protection in between such that I didn't have to deal with a lot of the stressful situations. This allowed me to cut my work time down from 50 or 60 hours a week to something like 10 hours a week. So what was magical about that is by using the art of subtraction, I created all this space in my life so that I can then start adding in new things that did fit my sense of identity and purpose. And I was able to explore, well, what do I really connect with? I had realized that all these years I had been doing things like writing and public speaking, all these things that I loved to do, but I was cramming them into these little time periods when I wasn't too busy at work because it was a quote unquote hobby. Well, now that I didn't have to worry about money as much, I could then say, well, I don't care if I make money or not. What actually lights me up and gets me excited? And that's when I started doing a lot more writing. I eventually started podcasting and even writing this book. So I was able to subtract out the friction in my life, add in things that were purposeful. And in fact, I think that's my goal of this book, and really to help people in general, is I want you to start getting rid of those things that don't serve you and add in things that do, that help you form a better sense of identity and purpose. A lot of people look at me and they say, well, you're kind of privileged, right? You realized all these things. You were a doctor. You had money saved. You had investments. That's a really privileged place. But I think that's almost a cop-out in a sense. I think even when we're not privileged, we have to really take an accounting of how we spend our time. That doesn't mean we can change immediately, but it means we have to start weighing the positives and negatives and use some of those tools we have to make change in our life. So I had a big tool when I realized I didn't want to be a physician anymore, is I had a lot of money. I had a high net worth and I had investments. But you know what? When I was in my 20s, I didn't have those tools, but I had other tools. I had my energy, I had my relationships, I had my education, I had other tools that I could have used to maybe create a better work life for myself from the beginning that I didn't take advantage of. And I think we have to start thinking about this even when we're young, even when we are literally just getting by. We have to start thinking about what tools can we use to subtract out that which we don't like and add in things that feel a lot more purposeful so that we can eventually kind of build that life we want to live. If you're doing things that are identity conserving, things that give you a sense of purpose, you don't necessarily need to be financially independent. You just need to have enough money to live. And you can build your way towards financial independence over decades and decades if you're doing things that are meaningful and important to you. And so I think we have to start looking at life under that lens.
This idea of the art of subtraction, I think, is, at least to me when I was reading about it, I think it it almost resonates a little bit more than the idea of pure financial independence, retiring early. For all the reasons that you just listed out, there are so many people I talk to now who they have a good job. A lot of times maybe they don't have like student loan debt, or maybe they do. But either way, they're in this place where it's almost this push and pull between, do I completely leave my job and start something new and fully give up that paycheck, or do I stay full-time, keep doing what I'm doing? It seems so binary. And I really like this idea of start by just taking away the things that you don't need. As you start to build financial security, are there things that you're doing that you actually don't like that you can just start, taking those off the list and start building a meaningful life that way?
Yeah, I mean, a few things come up as you say that. First and foremost, in a lot of ways, I define financial independence as living a life of purpose, identity, and connections, and having enough to survive. Mm-hmm. A lot different than the traditional idea of financial independence, which is having enough money, not needing to work. I don't think we necessarily have to put that not needing to work thing in, especially if your work creates a great sense of purpose and identity. Then I think the not working part is optional, and financial independence can really be something we pursue at a much younger age and with a much lower net worth. I like to talk about someone who's in their young 20s who just got out of college or decided not to go to college, and they're working a 9 to 5 and just making do, right? Just paying the bills. And a lot of those people would look at me and say, yeah, again, it's great. You can use the art of subtraction, but I'm just making it go here. I can barely keep my head above water. But again, I think we have to start looking at those other tools we have. When you're in your 20s, maybe you have weekends free. Maybe you have communities you can work with. Maybe you can start a side hustle that you're passionate about on the weekend because you're in your early 20s and you have lots of energy, whereas I'm almost 50 and I have a lot less energy. And that passion project can turn into some revenue. And maybe that passion project turns into some revenue and your 9 to 5 becomes a 10 to 4. Or it becomes a Monday through Thursday instead of a Monday through Friday. Even if you're in kind of the most barren of situations, being able to use some of those tools to take control of your life may actually help you use the art of subtraction, even when you don't have that much money in the bank. And I think that's the idea, is how can we start building that life now that we want, instead of saying, well, I will one day when I have enough money, because sometimes those one days don't come. Like for my father, who died at 40, he didn't have the years and decades of a future, and none of us know whether we will or not. So I think we have to be really thoughtful about starting to do things we want now if we can.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You make a good point there, where we all have our own levers that we can pull, whether that's time or energy or money, and it's going to look a little different for everybody. One thing I hear from a lot of people when they hear about like financial independence or even just cutting down hours at work, they're always like, well, what would you do? They don't maybe know, they're not in tune with what their interests or their passions are. And, for you were writing a little bit, so that's helpful. How would you recommend someone maybe start getting in touch with what sparks them?
So I think we use money and our jobs and all of these things as a mirage to actually keep us from doing the really hard work in life. And some of that really hard work in life is trying to figure out who we are and what is purposeful to us. And so the first thing we need to do is actually put purpose and identity first. I think we always put money first, or we put job or job title. We put all those things first. So the first thing is to actually realize, okay, I need to think about this, and this is difficult. And instead of looking at it as something that's scary or something you're afraid of, look at this as an opportunity to actually explore and challenge yourself to learn what it is that makes you tick. The other thing is your purpose doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be lifelong. You can have one purpose or many purposes. It's okay if your purpose isn't this big, important, incredible thing. Like, I know people who love yoga and their purpose became, I want to be a yoga instructor. And that was it, right? And they said, if I can teach a class and help a few people here and there, that gives me enough sense of purpose. So it's a really individualistic thing. In the book, I do go through some exercises that help you with purpose. With hospice patients, we do something called a life review, where they kind of ask important questions, fundamental questions about their life, how they've lived it up to that point, things they regret, things they wish they had the courage to try. And we use that to help bring them some peace as they get towards the end of the life. But I often think that we should be doing these life reviews at a much earlier age where we ask ourselves the tough questions. In the book, there's a whole questionnaire about the life review, but a really simple question to start asking yourself, which gets to the really core of the life review is, if you can imagine yourself on your deathbed bemoaning your life and saying, I really wish I had the energy, courage, or time to. The question is what comes after that? And that's something we can spend some time really thinking about. You don't have to answer that immediately, but most people deep down inside actually have these things that when they really think about it, they're like, yeah, I was always too afraid to pursue that, or I didn't have enough time, or I didn't have enough money, or something always got in the way, or people told me I couldn't do it. Like most people, when they really sit down and think about it, when you really imagine yourself dying and God, I wish I did whatever, that's when you really start coming to terms. And so that's part of what the life review process is. There are other questions that can really help you kind of try to figure that out. Like, when was the last time you woke up in the middle of the night excited by an idea and like you went to sleep and the next morning you forgot about it or blew it off or decided it wasn't realistic? There's all sorts of questions you can start asking yourself. The other thing is, even if you don't know what your sense of purpose is, by using the art of subtraction and actually opening yourself up to this idea, you give yourself time to start throwing the spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. So even if you don't know, then you kind of throw yourself out there. You volunteer, you meet new people, you do new things. And again, it doesn't have to be life-changing. It just has to be, I enjoy doing this a lot more than I did working my 9 to 5. I've created some life space in my life. I don't need to do the 9 to 5. Why don't I start filling up more time with this, whatever the this is, even if it's not your passion of passions? I think when we give ourselves the space and time and start doing things we like, we eventually start figuring it out. And I know that there are actually a lot of people who get anxiety when they start thinking about purpose. I don't think it has to be that big of a deal. I think we just have to look for things that feel better to us than working at a job we may or may not like. And if the answer is working at a job feels a lot better than these other things we're trying, then maybe working at that job is part of your purpose. And then again, we can use the art of subtraction or other tools to try to really get rid of the friction that is in that job and really bring out those things you like about it and help you spend more time doing that.
I really like the question of, like the core question here, which is, what do I wish I had the time, energy, or courage to have done? I know when I was running through that exercise, reading your book, it's interesting because I think you're exactly right. It's not so much about having a big purpose, like, I wish I'd accomplished this big, huge thing. But there are certain things that I can feel pulled towards. And at this point in my life, I'm like, it is for me less about maybe the time and the money and more about actually being brave enough to put myself out there, try these things that I know I may be interested in. And when you really think about, if I was looking back on my life and now I realize this is a regret I had, it's such a powerful exercise to actually think through that.
Yeah, let me tell you something that's really magical that I never realized until I worked with the dying. People don't regret what they failed at. People regret what they didn't have the courage to try. And so you can almost not fail in a sense if you're willing to go after those things that are important to you. The major failure is not doing it. And so that, I think, frees us quite a bit. Because I've had plenty of patients who reveled in their failures, but at least they tried, versus people who really regretted the fact that they never even put themselves in the arena and fought the fight. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah, I really like how in your book you go through all these different patient examples and like maybe what each of these different types of people experienced on their deathbed, because it kind of puts in perspective different things. As a hospice doctor, what are some things that you wish like the general population knew or thought about more that you think could help like enhance their lives?
So I think that we are really bad at self-evaluation, and this gets back to the life review. I think we put off the important things in our life until it's too late, and part of the reason is I think we're utterly afraid of death. And to think about what's really important to us reminds us that life is finite, and we don't like to be reminded that life is finite. So it's much easier to put it off to another day. And so we tend to concentrate on things that we think are important, but aren't. I think our jobs in some ways we think are these really important things, and whether we get that next promotion and whether we get that next title. And for most of us, not all, because some people really do find a sense of purpose in that, but for most of us, that's a little bit artificial. It's something that society told us we needed, or some goal we put in our mind that once we get there, we're not even happy because we think we have to get to the next thing. And so it's really hard for people to look at themselves and say, what do I really want out of life? And what can't I put off? And so that's what I think the dying really teach us, right? Because I talk about this a little bit in the book, the idea of the deus ex machina. It's a term for a plot twist, the last minute plot twist that makes everything better. And we see this in movies all the time, right? Things are going bad, and then something changes at the last minute and fixes everything. Well, when we do a life review with hospice patients and they really come to regrets, we try to do just that. We try to hodgepodge together whatever fix we can to give them something that feels like they're coming to some resolution with that idea. My goal is to help people not need a last minute plot twist. And the way you do that is you have to start thinking about these things now and not wait until you're on your deathbed. So that's what I think the dying really tell us, is that life is finite. Instead of running away from this idea, maybe we should embrace it and use that as a tool to start thinking about how we want to live today.
That's so well said, Jordan. I think that really resonates. And one thing I really like about your book is this perspective of looking at things like not just financial independence, but finding the things that are meaningful for you from the perspective of dying patients, from the perspective of reflecting on your own death. And I just think it's so beautifully said, trying to avoid that plot twist at the end and instead thinking about that now so that you can live a life, whatever that means to you, that's very meaningful.
And the great thing about it is now when you get to that perspective, you then can come back to the finances and say, oh, this is this really great tool, because money is a good tool. It does provide us some really good things. But I think until we get that first part right, we don't really know what to do with our money. And so that's what's really cool about this, is it comes back to the financial conversation eventually. It's like, okay, now I have a good idea of what is important to me. Let's figure out our finances so that we can pursue those things.
Yeah, it's so true. I think if you don't do that reflection, thinking about it now, I think that's when we spend money on things, is because we get to a point, we're making money, we haven't really thought about what's meaningful for us, so we only see money as an option to, okay, let me buy more things, let me upgrade the house, the car, whatever it is, even if we don't care that much about it, versus I like the perspective of money being a tool where you can not only build security for yourself, but also give yourself the opportunity to explore things that are more aligned with your values and are aligned with what you think your purpose might be in life.
Yeah, because no one sat on their deathbed and said, I really wish I drove a nicer car throughout life. That isn't what they're talking about. Most people don't say, man, I'm dying and I really wish I did that kitchen remodel. I mean, if I had done that kitchen remodel, life would have been so much better. Yeah, maybe there is someone who said that once, but it's not a common refrain.
Yeah, exactly. And I like how in your book, you talk about the life review and evaluating those things, but you also give people different ways to approach their finances, whether that's, save up a ton and then after that start to pursue financial independence, or a combination of like creating passive income while pursuing things that you like, or just finding something that just really, really sparks your passion. I think you really point out in your book that there's so many different ways people can do it. And I think that's why the book is so useful, because it really emphasizes death and that it's happening, but then also gives you tools to approach life too.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about it is financial independence is much more accessible than we think about it, especially when we broaden the definition of what financial independence really means. And again, I want to broaden that definition because money unto itself doesn't really do much for us. It only does things for us when it works as a tool to let us do what we want. So I don't really care how much money you have in your bank account. I don't care what your net worth is. I don't even really care what your investments are. I guess what I care about is your money serving you so that you can live the life you want to live? And I found that people are incredibly creative and find ways for money to serve them, even when they don't have a lot of it, right? You can do it even when you don't have a lot of it. Some of us want to have a lot of money because it serves us better that way, but not everybody. And so this idea that these concepts of financial independence are open to us all, regardless of where we are in our financial trajectory, just makes it a lot more reasonable, I think.
Jordan, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you? Where can they find your book? Where can they find the projects that you're working on right now?
So I pretty much create content in a few different places. The easiest way is to go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you can learn everything about the book. There are also links to the other places I create content. One is my podcast, the Earn and Invest podcast, which is also earnandinvest.com. But also there's links to my medical blog there, as well as links to Diversify, my financial blog. So you can find everything at jordangrumet.com.
Awesome. And we will link to everything in our show notes.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
Thank you so much,
Jordan.
Thank you so much, Jordan. It was so great chatting with you. Sammie, it was so nice to have Jordan on our podcast today. What are some takeaways?
I agree, Michelle. It was so nice to have Jordan on our podcast. I've been a huge fan for ever. So it's just super exciting to talk to him in person. For me, the biggest takeaway was this idea of a life review. Reading his book in particular, I especially like the question, if you were on your deathbed today, what would you regret not having the courage to do? I think something specifically about not having the courage just hits, because it's true. I just don't have the courage to do it. And I think that question just really brought up a lot for me too.
I agree, Sammie. And something I really like almost after you ask yourself that question is this idea of the art of subtraction that Jordan talks about, which is really about, hey, you don't have to dive headfirst into your purpose, into financial independence, into quitting your job and YOLOing. You can also just start to say, okay, are there certain things as I build financial security that I'm ready to let go? Maybe it's extra hours, maybe it's a specific shift, maybe you want to open up your schedule so you can try different things and see what really does align with you. I love that idea because I think it is scary to jump 2 feet in and hope for the best.
I agree, Michelle. I think we all have this perception. 1, we need to be completely financially independent, or 2, we need to completely leave our job, and neither of those are true. We can go part-time. We can cut back some responsibilities that we don't like. There are so many variations that give us the time and space to pursue things that we are really interested in.
Exactly, Sammie. And I think part of all of that is it just helps you start to untie your identity from work. Once you start shedding those things that you don't like, then it opens up space to say, okay, what do I like? And maybe you love your job, and that would be amazing. But also, maybe you start to explore new things. You get to try new things, meet people, work on passion projects. You open up that space, you can actually figure out what it is that you like. And I think one really cool thing about Jordan's story is that he really opened up space for himself to see how much he enjoyed writing, blogging, and even starting a podcast, writing a book. It's cool to look back and see how all of that has added up over time.
I agree, Michelle. And I also like that he points out that it could be big things or it could be small things. I think there's an easy, especially me being in healthcare, one thing I always think about, I'm am I really going to add space to do something more meaningful or more valuable? And that's not the point. The point is it something you're more interested in or something you're more passionate about? I think not everything that we do has to be so important or so utilitarianly valuable to society. It can just be something that we love.
Exactly, Sammie. And if you are listening to this, we are actually giving away 5 copies of Taking Stock by Dr. Jordan Grumet. We love the book. It's such a great look at both building good financial habits, but more through the lens of how do you want to live your life? It's sprinkled with really, really interesting stories of Jordan and his patients. And so we definitely recommend it. So shoot us an email, send us a text, reach out to us. The first 5 people that we hear from, we will gift you the book, Taking Stock.
Wait a second, Michelle. Did you just say that the first 5 people who message us are going to get a free copy of Jordan Grumet's book?
Yes, I did, Sammie. You heard us right. Send us an email, reach out to us. We would love to gift you the book. And let us know whenever you listen to this. Just send us a message, and you never know. You might be one of the 5.
Exactly. If you never try, you will never know if you could have failed.
Wow, great wrap up, great callback. And on that note, we enjoyed talking to you guys.
And most importantly, be sure to join us next time as we put down the rulebook and we rethink the status quo.